Welcome to Secret Story. Sophie Harper sat down on one of the chairs by the kitchen table. She was a little tired but happy that she had got the whole house spotless. It had taken her most of the afternoon but she had now nearly finished. Only the glass table to go now and she could go and have a nice long soak in the bath. Sighing, she thought that Josh, her boyfriend of 3 years, would be back soon, and not soon enough for her. Not like when Josh and she. Anywhere at any time, she loved the thrill of being caught, she always reached when there was a risk. Looking at the clock, she thought that she had lasted the entire day, she can wait another 2 hours for Josh to come home. So she made herself stand up and polish the table until it sparkled. That should get rid of some of my tension, she thought, smiling to herself as she headed off to take that soak she had wanted. Over half an hour later, Sophie was looking through her clothes, trying to decide what to wear. She said to herself. How about you, she said, looking at a black summer dress. Moving to the mirror and holding it against herself, she looked for a moment before throwing it onto the bed. It was too nice a day for black. She thought about short-cut jeans and a shirt but discarded that idea. It took too long to get the shorts off. Suddenly a thought hit her and she scrambled through her clothes. Found what she was looking for, grabbed them and put them on immediately. Standing in front of the full-length mirror, Sophie smiled to herself. At 22, she was a knockout. Long blonde hair falling straight past her shoulders, large blue eyes, full pink lips, just a thin waist which gave her a light hourglass figure, and although she was only 5 feet 6 inches, her legs still seemed to reach on forever. She was every guy's fantasy and more. Men always whistled at her when she walked anywhere and she loved it. She remembered a time when 2 teens had offered to do the gardening for her, but couldn't keep their eyes from her body as she lay on the lounge chair sunbathing. Well, she thought they deserved some kind of payment. She was wearing a short miniskirt, yellow, like the ones that she used to wear at school, yellow and white strappy shoes and a white top with 2 thin straps holding it over her shoulders, which Josh's car pulled into the driveway and stopped. He turned the engine off and could hardly contain himself. It was the big game tonight, Raiders versus Dolphins in the Super Bowl of the century. He had been waiting for this game and knew the Raiders would just kick the Dolphins all around the field. He had even driven too fast just to get here in time. The game started in half an hour. You really are looking forward to this game, aren't you? Ben said, looking at him with that cheeky grin of his. At 6 feet 2 inches, Ben was taller than Josh by 2 inches but not quite as built. They had been friends in school and had grown up together. Ben loved football too, but he loved being cheeky more. Right, I am a man. This is the biggest game of the season, Josh said as he got out of the car. Heading towards the front door, the pair bantered with each other about old times, even thought they saw each other often, they still loved doing it, and walked to the lounge. As soon as they walked through the door to the lounge, Sophie came bounding out of the kitchen and grabbed Josh and gave him a huge hug and a long, passionate kiss, probing his mouth with her tongue. After a couple of minutes, Sophie seemed to realize they were not alone and broke the kiss and moved back a little. Oh, hiya Ben, she said, smiling with a hint of red in her cheeks. Hey, Soph, Ben replied with that cheeky grin on his face again. Hey, babe. Ben's come over to watch the game with me tonight, you remember me saying? Josh asked. Oh yeah, of course I do, she said, blushing a little more. Sit down. I'll go get you some chips and dip. I'll be making dinner later on, so don't eat too many, she laughed. I could eat 'em all and all the dinner, Ben said after a little laugh. I have a big appetite. Sophie gave him a little smile, then walked off into the kitchen. She looked so hot in that short skirt and short top that Josh thought about canceling, watching the game. She'll be hot for some action tonight. I can watch the game and get some later, he thought. He sat on one of the sofas as Ben sat in a chair to his left. The lounge was large, with a sofa directly facing the TV, one to its right and a chair to the left, with the hallway behind the chair and the kitchen just behind the other sofa not too far away. Glass doors with thin white net curtains bunched to the side stood between the lounge and the kitchen. It wasn't an overly large house, but still big enough. The kitchen was large enough so that the doors led into a small space between the counters to the left and the table to the right. However, the glass table did begin to take up a little of that space. Sophie walked to the fridge. And taking out some chips and some beers, she thought to herself, why tonight? I should have remembered that. What am I going to do? Taking a minute to calm herself, she grabbed the snacks and went back into the lounge. After Sophie had gone into the kitchen and Ben had sat down on the chair, he thought to himself how Sophie was. Just then Sophie came back from the kitchen with some chips and beers and walked over in front of the other sofa and bent down to put the chips on the small table in the middle of the floor. As she bent down, the sight of, even for that brief amount of time, gave him a boner. He took a quick look at Josh, no he wasn't looking, and turned back to continue ogling Sophie. But when he looked back, she was sitting with her legs crossed, looking at the TV. Ben wished he could make a bet with Josh on the game for Sophie, like in the stories, then he could screw her like she needed to be screwed. But fantasy stories just don't come true, so he contented himself with looking at those gorgeously smooth legs. The game was about to begin. She looked at Josh, how handsome he is, she thought, then made herself stop because that was only making her worse. Josh was already into the game and didn't look at her. Sophie turned to look at Ben. His gaze shifted suddenly and looked at her face. Had he been staring at my legs, she wondered. Ben turned to look at the TV. No, he couldn't have. Just your imagination, girl. Only, when she looked at the TV she noticed a little while later his eyes went back to her. Every time she moved a little, his eyes would instantly go back to the game, but when she was still, they went back to studying her. He is looking at my legs, she thought after the 5th time. She felt a little jolt of excitement flow through her stomach and had a little thought. Well, if he wants to stare at my legs, I better give him a better look. So she shifted the way she was sitting from the corner of her eye. She noticed his eyes open a little wider, staring at her more openly. So she decided to have a little more fun. She also started biting the tip of her index finger on the other hand. Of course, another sign of boredom. Of course. Ben made a little fidget on the chair. After a few minutes, Sophie wanted to tease Ben a little more, but she couldn't think of anything discreet enough, until she looked at the packet of unopened chips on the table. Smiling inside, she stood up and walked into the kitchen. Then all of a sudden, she just stopped after looking at the chips and walked out. He even thought about going to the bathroom to jack off when Sophie came back with a white bowl in her hands. When she got to the table, she leaned forward and placed the bowl on the table, then leaning even further forward, began opening the bag of chips and gently tipping them into the bowl, making sure they looked just right. Ben's eyes, however, were not on the bowl. It seemed she was bent over for hours, but it must have been minutes. Then, staying bent as she was, she lifted her head. Want any? She asked sweetly. Yes, please, Ben said, stammering. She smiled and offered him the bowl. Then, after he had taken some, she offered some to Josh, who didn't move from looking at the TV. Sophie placed the bowl on Josh's lap and then straightened and sat down again. 20 minutes into the game, Sophie all of a sudden said, "Oh, where is that magazine?" and then knelt on the sofa and bent over the back to look for her magazine. The view was incredible. She can't be teasing me, he thought. It's just my imagination. But she looked like she was. He tore his eyes away from her. 10 minutes later, he looked back at her, legs crossed again, magazine lying on her lap. No. Thanks, he said, smiling. She must be teasing me, he thought. I can't take much more of this. Sophie felt like 10,000 volts of electricity were being charged through her. She was flirting and teasing quite openly with that ice pop, but the thrill was worth it. Josh still hadn't taken his eyes off the game. She didn't think he would, but it was still fun. But even this teasing wasn't as exciting as it could be. She loved risk. The riskier a situation, the better for her and the more pleasure it was. Now she came up with an idea. Standing up slowly, "Right, I'm going to make the dinner," she said when she had stopped stretching. "Need any help?" Ben asked, his voice trembling with anxiousness. "Sure," she said, smiling at him. As Sophie walked towards the kitchen with Ben following her, she stopped and said, "Honey, you might want to turn the volume up a little. I don't want the noise I will make, making dinner, to drown out your game." Then she walked through the doors, with Ben following her. As they entered the kitchen, Sophie heard the TV volume rise, not much, but higher than it was. Josh knew some of the machines in the kitchen were noisy, but Sophie wasn't planning on them making any noise at all. Sophie would, and although Ben wasn't as good looking as Josh, he wasn't bad either. He had a "that's what she needed." Walking over to the nearest counter visible through the doors, Sophie turned around and leaned against it, placing her hands on either side. Her heart was pounding almost off her chest. "So, what do you need help with?" Ben asked, that nervous tone still shook his voice. "I was thinking, for a football game, maybe some hot dogs. But I make them a special way. Josh never complains about my hot dogs. You see, I have to oil them, that way they are lubricated, but I always taste them first, before I use them. You can never be too careful, see." She smiled at him. "Come here. I'll show you how to make them," she cooed. Ben walked towards her, but as he did, he pulled the glass doors closed. "They have to stay open," she said to him with a pouty look on her face. "But, I thought, you didn't want to have the noise disturb Josh?" Ben asked. Sophie almost laughed at his naivety. "I don't, but I want the risk. Now, open them, or I won't show you," she said, smiling. The doors were open again the second she finished her sentence. Ben walked up to her. "Wah!" he started to say, but her smile quieted him. The thing never seemed to stop growing. "I think I should try some. Is it good?" "The best you'll ever have," said Ben, looking more confident than he was. Smiling up at him. If her boyfriend looked, all he would see was his 22-year-old girlfriend on her knees staring in disbelief at what must. All Sophie could do was gasp with wide eyes. "You're huge," she said incredulously. Ben smiled down at her. "You like?" Sophie nodded. "I think I might need to tell Josh to turn the volume up louder," she said. Halfway down the shaft, she paused. "I wish I could video this," he said. Sophie smiled at him and said, "Maybe next time we can." Smiling at her, he knew she would be back for more. "Your boyfriend is a lucky guy. You'll have to kiss him after this," he said. Sophie's eyes looked at him the entire time Josh sat watching the football game, completely engrossed. Not realizing that at that moment, less than 15 feet away, his beautiful girlfriend, he cheered as the Raiders scored a touchdown and Sophie closed her eyes. What a reward for her work. Sophie then turned to look through the doors. She saw that Josh still hadn't moved. She turned to Ben ready to say, "You might need a rest before the main course," but was stunned when she was confronted. "You," she exclaimed. "It must be you," he replied with a large smile. "And just what do you think you're going to do now?" she asked teasingly, again to his eyes. "I'm going to you, right on this counter, right where your boyfriend could see if he just turned his head." She smiled teasingly at him. "I don't even do that for Josh," she said. "You're not only gonna beg me, but you'll let me you whenever, wherever and however I want to." It felt so good. She had never felt anything like this in her life. While her boyfriend sat not 15 feet away in the next room, with the joining glass doors open. The volume of the TV was the only reason he couldn't hear. All it would take would be for him to turn his head, or turn down the volume a little, to notice the action 15 feet away from him. But Sophie didn't care any more. He slowed his pace and stopped. "No, no, no," Sophie complained in an angry voice. The eternity ring on Sophie's left hand glinted in the light. He remembered when her boyfriend had given her that ring. Sophie had said he was the only guy for her and the only guy she would ever be with. "You enjoying this?" he asked breathlessly. "Yes." "Want me to stop?" Ben said, "No," she loudly. She was his now. If Josh had come in at that moment, she wouldn't have been able to move a muscle. Now that was an amazing, she thought. He seemed to read the question on her face and answered. She was screaming now. Josh must have been able to hear. He asked, "Can I have you when, where, and however I want?" "Yes." "Oh, yes. You can me whenever," she said, "wherever," her eyes shut, "however you want," she smiled. So good, all she could hear was her heartbeat, her breathing and the constant words of "so good" coming from her mouth. Josh still sat watching the end of the game, completely unaware that his beautiful girlfriend was lying across the kitchen table. He didn't even notice they were missing. The Raiders were about to win after all. She walked to the mirror and straightened her hair as much as she could. It still looked a mess and her face was flushed. Straightening her skirt, she walked unsteadily on her legs. Ben grabbed her waist from behind and stopped her just by the glass doors. "That was great," he told her. "Come round soon," she said to him. "You can get a few of the guys round for a game of poker," she laughed. "Maybe some of the guys will want to play poker with you," he said. "Maybe," she said with that smile. "Wear that eternity ring, I like looking at it as you call out my name," he told her. "Ooh, I will." With a sparkle in her eye, she answered and walked back into the lounge with Ben following her. Josh watched as the Raiders made their final touchdown to win the Super Bowl and he jumped up yelling and screaming. "Woo-hoo! They did it," he yelled. He sat down and cracked open a beer to celebrate. Just then Sophie came in from the kitchen. Her hair looked a little messed up and her face was red too. Why were her clothes crumpled? Ben came in, his shirt was crumpled and his face was red too. "What happened to you two?" he asked. "We went to make dinner. It was really hot in there." We didn't make too much noise, did we?" Sophie said with a smile on her face. But Josh had already dismissed it. He told her that the Raiders had won the Super Bowl and she walked over to him, quickly and on very unsteady legs. Had she been drinking? She must have put too much salt in the food, as her mouth tasted salty. He asked her as much. "You wouldn't have liked the food. Even Ben wouldn't swallow it. So I had it all. I don't mind salty food, I have had 2 today. Too bad I ran out of time to make some more, but I'll definitely have some more again. I enjoyed it too much not to," she said proudly and with a smile at Ben. Ben had that cheeky grin on his face again. "Well, I better go then, mate, plane to catch tomorrow, you know," Ben said to Josh. "Honey, Ben wanted to ask you if you wanted to host a poker game here some night." "I don't mind if you do. I have lots I could do," Sophie said. "Sure, that's fine with me. Be prepared to lose your chips, though, Ben." "I'm better at poker than you," Josh replied, bantering with his old friend. "I think you had better be careful, Josh. Ben is really good at poker," Sophie said with that smile. "I'll see you out then, mate," Josh said to Ben. "Bye, Ben, I'll see you soon, I hope," Sophie said, smiling. When the two friends got to the door, Ben turned around and said, "I had fun tonight, man. Thanks for asking me over tonight. It's been great. And mate, that's one great girl you have there." Ben said thanks and Ben went out. Sophie watched as the two guys left the room. Smiling inside and outside, she loved teasing Josh, especially with those words that told of what went on in the kitchen. But Josh didn't notice, and that made her feel even naughtier. That was so kinky, she thought to herself, "I can't wait for this poker game. I will be the most entertaining hostess there can be." She was ready to again now. Life was about to get a lot kinkier for Sophie, and she was looking forward to it.